Do you know what Father Amorth told me right before he died? He looked me straight in the eyes and whispered, "The devil no longer needs to manifest as he once did. Now he disguises himself so well. Even the most devout Christians fall into his trap without realizing it." Those words haunted me for months, because after 70,000 documented exorcisms, the man who knew more about evil in this world than almost anyone was warning us about something entirely new. And now I understand why. Wait, before we go further, I need to ask you something very personal. Have you felt lately that something is different? I'm not just talking about the world, but on a spiritual level, as if there's a growing confusion about what is truly good and what only appears to be. Because according to Father Amorth's final writings, this is no coincidence. It's exactly what he predicted would happen. Look, I spent 3 years studying every case Father Amorth documented, every testimony, every manifestation, and I discovered something in his private archives that was never published, something he called the evolution of deception. And when you understand what that really means, you'll never see certain things the same way again. Father Amorth documented that in his first 20 years as an exorcist, manifestations of evil were, let's say, obvious, violent, grotesque, impossible to ignore. But in his last 15 years, something changed radically. People came to him with completely different problems. They weren't the dramatic possessions we see in movies. They were devout Christians, people who prayed daily, who went to Mass, who had seemingly holy lives, but who were being destroyed from the inside by influences they had unwittingly invited. And do you know what the most disturbing pattern was? These people swore they were following Christian spiritual practices. They had found new forms of prayer, new methods of meditation, new interpretations of the Bible that made them feel more connected to God. But Father Amorth saw something completely different when he examined them spiritually. He explained it with an analogy I'll never forget. Imagine the devil is a thief. Before, he'd break the windows and force his way in. Now, he dresses like the homeowner, rings the doorbell, and people open the door willingly, thinking they're welcoming a friend. And this is where it gets really unsettling, because Father Amorth identified exactly 7 new ways evil is infiltrating the lives of modern Christians. 7 disguises so perfect that even experienced priests have fallen for them. I'm going to share these 7 signs with you. But first, you need to understand something crucial about who Father Amorth really was. Because we're not talking about theories or speculation. We're talking about the direct observations of a man who confronted evil face to face more than almost anyone else in modern history. Gabriele Amorth wasn't just any priest. He was the official exorcist of the Diocese of Rome. He founded the International Association of Exorcists. He performed over 70,000 verified and documented exorcisms, many in the presence of doctors, psychiatrists, and other specialists who arrived skeptical and left completely transformed by what they witnessed. But there's something few people know. In his last 5 years of life, Father Amorth became obsessed with something he called the Great Deception. He stopped accepting cases of dramatic possessions and focused exclusively on something far more subtle and, according to him, far more dangerous. He said, "The devil has understood that obvious possessions only serve to strengthen people's faith. Now his strategy is far more intelligent, to make Christians believe they are growing spiritually when in reality they are moving away from God." And the cases he documented in those last years are disturbing in a completely different way. For example, there's the case of Mary Ellen, a 45-year-old mother of 3 who had been a catechist for 20 years. She came to Father Amorth because although her spiritual life seemed to be flourishing more than ever, her family was falling apart. Her children had become rebellious. Her husband was growing distant, and she herself experienced a peace she described as strange. When Father Amorth examined her, he discovered something chilling. Mary Ellen had begun practicing a form of Christian meditation she had learned at a very popular retreat, a technique that supposedly helped her connect directly with God without the need for the traditional church. During spiritual examination sessions, Father Amorth observed that every time Mary Ellen entered her state of meditation, her personality subtly changed. She became colder, more distant, more critical of traditional Catholic doctrine, and most disturbingly, she developed an inexplicable aversion to the Blessed Sacrament, but she didn't realize it. In her mind, she was closer to God than ever. This is exactly the kind of deception Father Amorth warned us about, and Mary Ellen is not an isolated case. In his archives, I found more than 300 similar cases documented in his last 5 years alone. And do you know what they all have in common? They all started with practices that sounded perfectly Christian. All were presented as deeper or more authentic forms of spirituality. And all led people away from true union with God, even though they believed the opposite. Now, before I reveal the 7 specific signs Father Amorth identified, I need you to understand why this is so urgent. Because according to his calculations, based on the patterns he observed, these new forms of spiritual deception are growing exponentially. In 2010, he estimated that perhaps 5% of the consultations he received corresponded to these subtle cases. By 2015, it was already more than 40%. And in his last notes written a few weeks before he died, he wrote a phrase that sent chills down my spine. I fear that most Christians who believe they are growing spiritually are actually being prepared for something terrible. Prepared for what? That's a question that's haunted me ever since I read those files. But what I can share with you are the specific signs he identified, the red flags that allow us to discern between genuine spiritual growth and what he called poisoned growth. And believe me, when you see these signs, you'll start recognizing them everywhere. In best-selling spirituality books, at massive Christian conferences, in trendy prayer techniques, in progressive-sounding, liberating biblical interpretations. The first sign Father Amorth identified is something he called the peace that divides. And it's arguably the most dangerous because it's the most alluring. This sign appears when a person begins to experience a sense of peace and spiritual well-being, but simultaneously becomes emotionally distant from those closest to them, especially those who maintain traditional Catholic practices. Father Amorth observed this pattern in hundreds of cases. The person describes feeling more connected to God than ever, but their family relationships deteriorate. Their longtime friends perceive them as changed, colder, more critical, and instead of worrying about this, they interpret it as spiritual growth that others can't understand. In the case of Maria Elena, whom I mentioned, she described feeling a deep peace during her meditations, but that peace was accompanied by a growing contempt for what she called the superficial Christianity of her family. She began to see traditional prayers as mechanical and Mass as an empty ritual. The most chilling aspect is that this transformation happens gradually. The person doesn't wake up one day being different. It's a subtle process that can take months or even years, and throughout that time, they genuinely believe they are growing spiritually. Father Amorth explained that this peace that divides is an almost perfect imitation of God's true peace. The difference lies in the fruits. God's genuine peace unites, heals relationships, generates humility and love for others. False peace isolates, generates spiritual pride and contempt for traditional forms of faith. But here's what's truly disturbing. When Father Amorth tried to explain this to the affected individuals, they violently resisted accepting it, not with physical aggression, but with an emotional and mental resistance he described as supernatural. It was as if something inside them protected them from seeing the truth about their condition. The second sign he documented is even more subtle, the knowledge that puffs up. This happens when a person begins to receive spiritual revelations or insights that make them feel special or chosen, especially if this knowledge contradicts or goes beyond traditional Catholic teaching. Father Amorth noted that these individuals developed a very particular way of talking about their faith. They used phrases like, "God showed me that," "The Holy Spirit revealed to me that," or, "Now I understand what this verse really means." And invariably, these revelations led them away from Catholic doctrine toward more personal or liberating interpretations. I remember the case of Carlos, a 52-year-old man who had been a seminarian in his youth. He came to Father Amorth because his wife was worried about his behavior. Carlos had begun to have visions during prayer that revealed hidden truths about the Bible. According to Carlos, God was showing him that the church had misinterpreted many of Christ's teachings. He felt called to be a kind of modern prophet who would correct these errors, and the more revelations he received, the more arrogant and dismissive he became toward anyone who questioned his new insights. What most disturbed Father Amorth about this case was the nature of the revelations. They weren't obvious blasphemies. They were interpretations that sounded spiritual, progressive, even compassionate, but subtly undermined the authority of the Church and the necessity of the sacraments. During the spiritual examination process, something extraordinary happened. When Father Amorth sprinkled holy water in the room where Carlos had had his visions, Carlos experienced a violent physical reaction: nausea, dizziness, an inexplicable feeling of panic. That was the first clue that Carlos's revelations weren't coming from where he believed. But here's the part that disturbs me most about this case. Even after that obvious reaction to the holy water, even after Father Amorth explained what was happening, Carlos refused to accept that his experiences might not be divine. He rationalized the reaction to the holy water as resistance of his ego to spiritual growth. He found an explanation for every warning sign Father Amorth showed him. It's as if these deceptive influences come equipped with a self-defense system that allows them to resist any attempt at exposure. And this brings me to the third sign, which Father Amorth considered the most dangerous of all: resistance disguised as discernment. This sign appears when a person develops an automatic and irrational resistance to any ecclesiastical authority or teaching that contradicts their new spiritual experiences, but interprets this resistance as mature spiritual discernment. In other words, when someone points out that something might be wrong with their spiritual practices, they don't simply ignore it. They feel a visceral emotional repulsion towards correction, but interpret it as confirmation that they are on the right path. Typical phrases of this sign include, "I feel in my spirit that this is not from God. My heart tells me that this person is trapped in religiosity," or "God is protecting me from this negativity." Father Amorth observed that this resistance intensifies particularly when the correction comes from traditional sources, older priests, the magisterium's teachings, or people who practice classic forms of Catholic spirituality. It's as if there's an invisible filter that automatically categorizes any traditional warning as old religiosity or lack of openness to the Spirit. Now, take a moment and think honestly. Have you experienced any of these three signs? Have you felt that peace that emotionally distances you from others? Have you had revelations that make you feel special or more enlightened than other Christians? Have you developed an automatic resistance to certain traditional teachings of the Church? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, please don't panic, but don't ignore it either, because what I'm going to share with you now are the 4 remaining signs that Father Amorth documented. And these 4 are specifically designed to attack the deepest foundations of the Catholic faith. But before I continue, I need you to understand something that Father Amorth constantly repeated in his later years. The goal is no longer to destroy faith. The goal is to corrupt from within, so people believe they're serving God, when in reality, they're serving his opposite. This distinction is crucial because it means that people affected by these subtle deceptions don't feel like they're drifting away from God. On the contrary, they feel as though they're drawing closer to him than ever before. And that's precisely why these deceptions are so devastatingly effective. The 4th sign Father Amorth meticulously documented is something he called false spiritual freedom. And when you understand what it truly means, you'll begin to see it everywhere in modern Christianity. This sign appears when a person begins to experience a feeling of liberation from what they perceive as restrictive religious rules, but simultaneously develops a new form of slavery they don't recognize as such. Let me tell you about Laura, a 38-year-old woman who had been deeply devout her entire life. She came to Father Amorth because her confessor was concerned about the dramatic changes in her spirituality. Laura had discovered what she called the true gospel of freedom. She had begun attending a group of liberated Christians who taught that the traditional moral rules of the Church were human burdens that Christ came to remove. According to this group, God wanted his children to be truly free, to express their love without the artificial constraints of religious moralism. It sounded beautiful, didn't it? It sounded like what any modern Christian would want to hear. But Father Amorth observed something disturbing during his sessions with Laura. The more liberated she felt from traditional moral norms, the more enslaved she became to her impulses and emotions. She had stopped attending Mass regularly because she felt God more in nature. She had abandoned confession because God forgave her directly. and she had begun making decisions about her marriage and family based solely on what she felt in her heart. What alarmed Father Amorth most was that Laura had developed a near-total inability to deny herself anything. If she had a desire, she interpreted it as divine guidance. If something caused her discomfort or required sacrifice, she saw it as a religious burden from which she had been freed. In essence, she had exchanged spiritual discipline for what she believed was freedom, but which was actually a more subtle form of slavery. During the examination process, Father Amorth did something he carefully documented. He asked Laura to pray a complete Our Father, especially the part that says, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Laura physically could not complete that prayer. Every time she reached the word temptation, she would become distracted or involuntarily change the subject. It was as if something inside her resisted the very idea that she might need protection against temptation, because, according to her new theology of freedom, there was nothing from which she needed to be protected. Everything was love, everything was grace, everything was freedom. But Father Amorth knew that when someone loses the ability to recognize temptation, they automatically lose the ability to resist it. And this brings me to the fifth sign, which Father Amorth considered one of the most devastating: the erosion of the sense of sin. This sign doesn't manifest as a dramatic denial of the concept of sin. It's far more subtle than that. It manifests as a gradual reinterpretation of sin in purely psychological or social terms, eliminating its spiritual dimension. People affected by this sign still use the word sin, but they no longer refer to offenses against God that require repentance and sacramental forgiveness. They refer to psychological problems that require healing, or to social injustices that require activism. Father Amorth documented cases of people who could eloquently discuss the sins of capitalism or machismo, but who had completely lost the ability to see their own moral failings as offenses that separated them from God. I remember the case of Robert, a 46-year-old man who had been very active in his parish. He came to Father Amorth because his wife was desperate. Robert had begun to engage in what he called Christian social justice, but he had lost all interest in his personal prayer life and the growth of his own holiness. Robert could talk for hours about the structural sins of society, but when Father Amorth asked him when he had last confessed, Robert replied, "I don't need to confess to a priest anymore. I confess directly to God by working for justice." During the examination sessions, something extraordinary emerged. Robert had developed a kind of spiritual blindness towards his own failings. He could clearly see the flaws in others, especially in oppressive structures, but he had completely lost the ability to see his own moral errors. When Father Amorth pointed out specific patterns of pride, anger, or lack of charity in his life, Robert automatically reinterpreted them as righteous indignation or passion for justice. It was as if he had developed a spiritual immune system that automatically deflected any acknowledgement of personal sin. But the most disturbing thing was that Robert genuinely believed he was closer to God than ever before. He saw himself as someone who had evolved beyond selfish religiosity towards a mature and socially committed faith. Father Amorth observed that this blindness to personal sin manifested especially in three areas: spiritual pride, justified anger, and rationalized lust. Affected individuals developed the ability to spiritually justify any behavior or attitude as long as they could frame it in terms of justice, authenticity, or Christian freedom. Now, the sixth sign Father Amorth documented is perhaps the most insidious of all: the hunger that is never satisfied. This sign appears when a person develops a seemingly insatiable spiritual appetite for new experiences, revelations, prayer techniques, or esoteric knowledge, but simultaneously loses interest in the traditional spiritual practices that once nourished them. It's as if they've developed a form of spiritual bulimia. They voraciously consume all kinds of spiritual content, but never feel truly nourished. The case that impacted Father Amorth the most in this category was that of Anna Maria, a 51-year-old woman who had been deeply devout her entire life. She came to Father Amorth because, although she felt more spiritual than ever, she experienced a constant feeling of inner emptiness. Anna Maria had begun exploring what she called the hidden riches of Christianity. She had read dozens of books on Christian mysticism, attended numerous retreats from various spiritual traditions, learned techniques of contemplative meditation, and started experimenting with prayer forms promising more direct experiences with God. But the more she consumed, the hungrier she felt spiritually. Father Amorth observed something fascinating during his sessions with Anna Maria. When he asked about her traditional prayer life, he discovered she had gradually abandoned all the practices that once sustained her spiritually. She no longer prayed the rosary because it seemed repetitive. She no longer practiced Lectio Divina because she preferred more profound, mystical texts. She no longer attended Eucharistic adoration because she had found meditation forms that gave her more intense sensations. Essentially, she had traded spiritual bread for spiritual candy, and like anyone replacing nutritious food with sugar, she felt constantly unsatisfied yet addicted to the sensations the new practices provided. Most alarmingly, Anna Maria had lost the ability to find God in simplicity. She needed increasingly extraordinary experiences to feel she was truly in contact with the divine. During a particularly revealing session, Father Amorth asked Anna Maria to simply sit in silence for 10 minutes, without any special technique, just in God's presence. Anna Maria couldn't do it. She felt agitated, anxious, as if she were wasting time. Her mind immediately started searching for a technique, a method, an experience that would make those 10 minutes feel spiritually productive. She had lost the ability to simply be with God. And this brings me to the seventh and final sign, which Father Amorth considered the most dangerous because it's the hardest to detect: the holiness that isolates. This sign appears when a person begins to experience what they believe are elevated levels of holiness or connection with God. But these supposed spiritual advancements progressively distance them from communion with other Christians, especially those practicing simpler forms of faith. The affected person doesn't feel superior in an arrogant way. On the contrary, they often feel misunderstood or lonely on their special path with God. But the result is the same: spiritual isolation. The clearest case Father Amorth documented was that of Francisco, a 43-year-old man who had been very active in his parish community. He came because his wife and children were worried about his growing emotional distance. Francisco had begun experiencing what he described as mystical unions during prayer. These experiences filled him with peace and made him feel extraordinarily close to God. But simultaneously, he had begun to feel that very few people could understand his level of spiritual experience. Gradually, he stopped participating in community activities because he found the conversations and concerns of other Christians to be superficial. He stopped enjoying parish mass because he preferred his private moments of direct communion with God. His children started saying Dad had become strange and no longer seemed interested in their lives. His wife felt spiritually inferior and excluded from her husband's new inner life, but Francisco interpreted all these reactions as proof that he had reached a level of holiness others couldn't comprehend. He saw himself as someone called to a special path, higher than ordinary Christianity. During the spiritual examination, Father Amorth made a crucial observation. He asked Francisco to describe his mystical experiences in detail. What emerged was revealing. Francisco's experiences were characterized by a sense of spiritual superiority and separation from others. He felt chosen for special experiences that placed him above the common flock. His unions with God didn't fill him with humility and love for others, but with a subtle yet constant feeling of being spiritually superior. Father Amorth explained that true mystical union always produces profound humility and intensified love for others, especially those in earlier stages of the spiritual journey. If a spiritual experience makes us feel superior or isolates us from the community of faith, that's a clear warning sign. But Francisco, like all the cases I've mentioned, resisted this assessment. He interpreted Father Amorth's correction as evidence that even experienced priests couldn't understand his special level of grace. Now that you know the 7 signs, you're probably wondering, what do we do with this information? How do we protect ourselves from such subtle deceptions? The answer lies in what Father Amorth developed during his later years: the Amorthian discernment protocol. A specific method he taught only to his closest disciples, designed to detect and neutralize these subtle influences before they take deep root. This protocol isn't just theory, it's a practical 5-step system that any Catholic can implement to protect themselves from the great deception Father Amorth warned us about. The first step of the protocol is what he called the daily examination of fruits. Each night, for exactly 7 minutes, you must honestly examine the fruits of your spiritual life that day, using 3 specific questions Father Amorth formulated. First question: did my spiritual practice today bring me closer to the people God has placed in my life, or did it emotionally distance me from them? This question is designed to immediately detect the sign of peace that divides or holiness that isolates. Second question: did the spiritual insights I received today make me more humble and dependent on God's grace, or did they make me feel more special or advanced than other Christians? This question detects knowledge that puffs up. Third question: did I feel any emotional resistance today towards fraternal correction, ecclesiastical authority, or the traditional practices of the Church? This question identifies the resistance disguised as discernment. Father Amorth insisted that these questions be asked exactly as worded, no modifications, because each word was carefully chosen to penetrate the defenses these subtle deceptions build in our minds. The second step in the protocol is the rule of 3 confirmations. Before adopting any new spiritual practice and prayer technique or biblical interpretation, you must seek confirmation from 3 specific sources: a spiritual director with at least 10 years of experience, a document from the magisterium of the Church supporting that practice, and observable fruits in the lives of at least 3 recognized saints. This rule is designed to protect you from false spiritual freedom and the hunger that is never satisfied, ensuring that any new spiritual direction is firmly rooted in the proven tradition of the Church. The third step is the test of holy discomfort. Once a week, you must do something specifically difficult or uncomfortable for the love of God. Fast from something you enjoy, serve someone who irritates you, or practice a virtue that is challenging for you. This test immediately detects if you've developed the inability to deny yourself, which is characteristic of false spiritual freedom. If you find it impossible or extremely difficult to make voluntary sacrifices for God, that's a clear warning sign. The fourth step is the monthly inventory of sins. Once a month, you must perform an examination of conscience specifically focused on your personal moral failings, using a traditional, not psychological, examination of conscience. You must specifically ask yourself, how have I offended God this month? What thoughts, words, actions, or omissions have damaged my relationship with Him? If you find you cannot identify specific sins, or that you automatically reinterpret your failings as psychological or social problems, you have detected the erosion of the sense of sin. The fifth and final step is the weekly sacramental anchor. Each week, you must dedicate at least an hour to a traditional and sacramental spiritual practice: Eucharistic adoration, confession, reading the lives of saints, or praying the rosary. This practice is designed to keep you connected to the traditional sources of grace that have sustained the saints for centuries, protecting you from developing exclusive dependence on novel spiritual experiences. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This protocol might sound restrictive or legalistic, but Father Amorth explained that these protective measures are like a seatbelt in a car. They don't limit your ability to travel, but they protect you in case of an accident. And according to his observations, we are living in a time of frequent spiritual accidents. New forms of spiritual deception are proliferating faster than ever, and many sincere Christians are being hurt without realizing it. But there's something more you need to know. Father Amorth believed that these subtle deceptions are not just random attacks. They are part of a coordinated strategy to prepare Christians for something he called the silent apostasy. In his final notes, he wrote, "The goal is not to make Christians openly abandon their faith. The goal is to corrupt their faith from within, so that when the final test comes, they believe they are being faithful to God when they are actually betraying Him." What is this final test? Father Amorth never clearly specified, but based on his writings, he seemed to have believed that a time is approaching when Christians will be called to choose between a form of Christianity that will sound more compassionate, inclusive, and modern, and the traditional Catholic faith that will seem outdated and rigid. And his fear was that Christians who have been subtly prepared by these deceptions will automatically choose what seems more loving and evolved, without realizing they are choosing an imitation instead of the original. That's why he insisted so much on the importance of discernment, not because he was pessimistic, but because he deeply loved the church and wanted to protect it. His final public words were, "Stay close to the sacraments, stay close to tradition, and don't be afraid to seem old-fashioned. It's better to be considered rigid by men than to be considered lukewarm by God." And now, after sharing with you all this knowledge that Father Amorth passed on to me, I have a final question for you. What are you going to do with this information? Because knowledge without action is useless, and Father Amorth always said that every person who understands these dangers has a responsibility to protect themselves and help protect others. This isn't about living in fear. It's about living with wisdom. It's about loving true union with God so much that we are willing to reject even the most seductive imitations. As Father Amorth said, the devil is afraid of Christians who know the difference between the authentic and the false, but he has nothing to fear from Christians who believe that everything that feels spiritual must come from God. The choice is yours. You can implement the Amorthian discernment protocol and protect yourself from these subtle deceptions, or you can wait and trust that your spiritual intuition will be enough. But remember the final words Father Amorth addressed to me. The time of spiritual naivete is over. Either we learn to discern, or we will be deceived. May God bless you and protect you on this path, and may the wisdom of Father Amorth help you remain firm in the true faith, no matter how attractive the alternatives may seem, because in the end, as he always said, only the truth will set us free, and the truth needs no disguise.